Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to discuss some of the factors I believe contributed to Yuki Tsunoda having such a miserable 2025 F1 season. So to start this video, I want to compare Tsunoda's results relative to Verstappen on both qualifying and in race performance compared to some of his past teammates. So first, when we look at qualifying gaps to Tsunoda since from 2019 onwards, we can see that all the gaps are pretty big. Perez was the closest in 2022, 3.5 tenths. The biggest gap was actually Albon's rookie season when he, of course, came in mid-season for the last 9 races of the year. Qualifying gap of 5.6 tenths of a second to Verstappen, and then all the other numbers kind of fit somewhere in the middle. And to be honest, while Tsunoda is certainly at the higher end of this range, he actually did better than Perez in 2023 and did better than Albon in 2019. So the qualifying, I don't think was actually that big of a problem for Tsunoda this past season. But there are a lot of factors I think made the end results, points gap, that kind of thing look much, much worse. And that contributes to the disparity between these results in qualifying and the race gaps to Verstappen. So these numbers here are basically the teammate race model, where basically it's a model that I like to use to compare the performances of teammates in a F1 season, and this is basically measured as units of 2 standard deviations. So a score of 4 would basically be 2 standard deviations. So still very, very extreme. And then of course, when you look over the right hand side, you can see Tsunoda with a 7.7. That's very, very close to, that's more than 3 standard deviations, which I think highlights just how statistically extreme this past season was. And so when you look at all of Verstappen's teammates since 2019, obviously Tsunoda stands out almost with a score that's almost close to double the next biggest one. So Tsunoda Verstappen gap 7.72. The next highest one is actually Albon and Verstappen from 2020 at 4.49. And then you have a couple others that are in the 4s. You have the Perez in 2021, and then you have Perez 2024 as well. And so obviously, just from looking at this numbers, I think it's very easy to say, Tsunoda performed the worst of the bunch by a fair margin. And that's something that maybe you can argue that, yes, he perhaps was worse than the other 3. And he's a worse, Grand Prix driver in terms of performance in a Grand Prix compared to the other 3. And that's something we'll talk about towards the end of the video. But there's some things that I kind of want to talk about that I think also contribute quite a bit to why this number is 7.72 and much bigger than all of these, where the qualifying performances are all pretty close together. And that is, the first is the fact that the field spread this year is obviously very, very close. And that's something that I think was a massive contributing factor. So one way to look at this is, so on the x-axis here, we have the median gap in qualifying to Verstappen. This is kind of oriented the other way, where it's minus. So this is basically the gap for Verstappen. But you have Perez in 2022, the lowest, obviously, and then Albon in 2019 down here. And then on the y-axis, we have difference in starting position. Now, some of these years, some of these results will be skewed by things like grid penalties, and they would especially affect Verstappen more so than his teammate, because of course Verstappen's more often than not qualifying well in front of his teammates. But so that's kind of why you see kind of the skew down here with the Albon 2019 here, a bit of an outlier. But generally, obviously, it makes sense that the bigger the gap in qualifying, the farther apart you would start on the starting grid. But of course, there's a lot of fluctuation here from year to year. So, for example, let's just look at Albon in 2020. This is obviously a 1 full season, shortened season, 17 races, but nonetheless. So you can see here the qualifying gap was just a little bit less than half a second. And in this season, the starting position difference on average between Verstappen and Albon was just over 4 positions. When we look at Paris 2023 qualifying gap, again, only 2 years before this past season, 2025, qualifying gaps about 5.2, 5.3 tenths of a second, and starting position difference is about 6 positions. So very, very big. And then actually, when we look chronologically, go to Paris 2024, he was almost a tenth of a second closer to Verstappen this past season, but the despite the fact that he was that much closer, the starting position difference was almost identical, about 6 positions or so. And then we get to 2025, of course, and the qualifying gap is about a little bit better than 2023, a little bit worse than 2020, and somehow that average starting position gap is 10 positions, which is 4 more than the next highest, which is of course ironically enough Perez in 2024. And that kind of shows that the chronological pattern here is that over the last 2 to 3 seasons, as the grid has closed up, partially because of the regulations have been consistent for the last 4 seasons from 2022 to this year, but also I think the cost cap's also playing a pretty big role in this, and it means that it's really reining in the performance of I would say the top 3 or 4 teams, the big spenders, your Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull. I would kind of put McLaren in there as well, because even though there have been times where they haven't been very good, they have been generally one of the bigger spenders in F1, and that really helps keep the smaller teams like your Haas, Sauber, Racing Bulls closer to those front-running teams. And so I think this has been a really massive contributing factor that's really negatively affected Tsunoda's performance in 2025. Qualifying performance is not terrible, but because the grid is so much smaller, it's massively extenuating or exaggerating the gap in terms of starting position difference, which of course then has big repercussions on Grand Prix performance. So this is a visualization of basically the pole gap, the median pole gap of every driver each season from 2019 to 2025. And so I've highlighted Verstappen in blue here, and his teammates are in red. I kind of averaged Gasly and Albon together in 2019, as their numbers were very, very close. And so basically, being closer to pole would be 100%. If you took pole position every single race, or even I think less than basically half the races, if you took pole for half the races, irrespective of what happened in the other half, you basically get 100% of your median pole gap. Of course, for most of the field, this is kind of an irrelevant point, but it just kind of highlights that when you look, for example, at 2019, for example, these are the 2 Williams. This is Russell. This is Kubica, 104%, 105, and you can see the back of the grid has generally come down every single year to a point where 2025, the slowest cars in qualifying were the slowest drivers were at about 102%, so about 3% less. And in F1, even though it's only 3%, that's still a massive difference. And I think the other big thing, the big trend to look at, is the fact that the gap between what's considered to be the front runners and the gap between the midfield has closed up substantially. So in 2019, for example, these are the front-running drivers, and so the lowest of those front-running drivers was almost certainly going to be probably Vettel or Leclerc. As you can see, Verstappen's not the lowest dot on, not the highest dot on this group, but basically it would be a little bit less than 101%, and then there would be this massive, almost 1% difference to the midfield, which would start somewhere around 101.5%. Then you get to 2020, which is again a bit of a strange year. Ferrari went backwards massively. You only really had 3 front-running drivers, and so you can see again the gap is still there, but it is starting to shrink a little bit. And then basically by 2021, it's shrunk even more. 2022, I think, opened up a little bit with the new regulations, but basically from 2022 onwards, you can see the gaps have basically shrunk to a point where when you look at 2025, the entire field is so spread to, condensed together, that you can't even really distinguish a gap between the front runners and everyone else. And this is something that I think has really negatively affected Verstappen's teammates' recent performances, especially 2024, 2025. Now, if we look at Verstappen's teammates relative to kind of the midfield and the front runners, 2019, you can see Gasly and Albon were basically right at the front of that midfield group. 2020, Albon was a little bit inside that group, but still towards the front. 2021, of course, Perez was basically this little bunch here is, I think, the Ferraris and the McLarens, but clear of basically everyone else. 2022, Perez qualified really close to Verstappen. That was his best year in qualifying, and you can see well clear of the midfield. 2023, though, this is where things start to go bad, even in the very, very dominant car that year. And you can see, there's quite a few drivers qualifying between himself and his teammate. And then 2024, you can see even more cars between himself and his teammate. And again, but at the same time, Perez is still kind of towards the front of the midfield. But then 2025 is where things get really bad. And basically, Tsunoda was basically in the middle of the midfield towards, almost the second half of the grid. Basically, as you can see, all these cars basically had better qualifying performances than him. So these two factors together really hurt. And obviously, in terms of the Red Bull car's performance, if we just assume Verstappen's been relatively the same level all of these years, some of the years like this year where it was definitely not as good as 24, 23, Verstappen's is a bit worse, and of course that means, Tsunoda's obviously performed worse as well, relative than what he would have done in 23 or 24. And so that's obviously something that also has probably negatively hurt Tsunoda a little bit there. So that's one big thing that the grid has really condensed up, and it's basically meant that even if Tsunoda's qualifying gaps are still roughly the same, it's basically put him much further back in the pack than it has for Verstappen's previous teammates in other seasons. Now, the other big thing that's, I think, been an interesting issue, not necessarily interesting, but I think definitely a big problem, I think is a better word of putting it, and that is dirty air, and how wheel-to-wheel racing has been a massive problem in 2025. And so this was an article done by The Race on November 26, 2025 by John Noble and Ed Straw, so about a little bit before the end of the season, and their title was Revealed, the Data on F1's Worsening Dirty Air Problem. And in that article, they had this really nice graph here, which I'm going to show, how well F1 cars can follow. And so in blue, they have at 10 meters back from the car in front, and then at red is 20 meters, so basically double the distance. And then on the y-axis, they have a percent of total downforce retained. So basically, 100% would mean that you basically don't feel any dirty air at all. And obviously, 0 would mean, I'm not even sure what 0 would be. It would just mean you'd be stuck in not being able to drive at all. But nonetheless, you can see, comparing different seasons here. 2019 apparently was actually not very good. At 10 meters, it was about, you only retained a little bit over 50% of your downforce. 2022, the first year of the ground effect cars, it was about 80% you retained. And I know that here it's averaged out between 2023 and 2025, but I think you've noticed a big difference each of the 3 years, with this year being the worst. And so for the average of those 3 years, it's about 50 to 60%. And so that's obviously not. It would be nice to spread the 3 out so that you can see the differences year on year. I suspect that if you had 2025 alone, it would be probably closer to 15, closer to the 2019 data. And then of course this is the predicted data for 2026, which we're not going to look at today, but it kind of highlights that, over this regulation set, especially comparing the 2022 to 2023 to 2025, it shows that the dirty air has gone a lot worse. Interestingly, it's still better than 2019 apparently. Of course the average is better, but I would expect this year is probably maybe about the same as 2019. But of course, the one problem is that when you compare 2019 to 2025, there's massive differences here in how the field is spread out. And so in 2019, a car could have a grid penalty and they could start at the back, and they could generally make their way through the field relatively, not necessarily easily, but usually you could expect them to get back to 5th or 6th place from starting from last on the grid, and that was kind of a reasonable expectation. But of course, this year, if you start last on the grid, unless you're Verstappen in Brazil, you're probably going to maybe get 10th, 9th if you're lucky, but many times drivers in that kind of situation have basically been 15th, 16th, 14th, 12th quite often, just because it's impossible to follow because the gaps are too small between the cars on the grid, and then also dirty air is also making things a little bit worse as well. So there's two big things there that have definitely contributed to, for Tsunoda, started in the pit lane many races this season, and that would definitely, even if the car was relatively quick on race day, it would definitely negatively affect his ability to come through the field. So those are kind of the two kind of big mitigating factors that you can argue, okay, those are things that are, not really Tsunoda's fault, they're outside of his control, that are contributing to his Grand Prix performances being much worse than they otherwise should be. Now, the other obviously more obvious argument is, is Tsunoda just a worse Grand Prix driver, worse racer than the other three? Now, on my race data on my race rating model. So this is basically comparing race performance, Grand Prix performance against historical data from 2000 to 2025. It was a list I released in the fall. And so we're just going to highlight those 4 drivers, and these are their career totals. So not their totals at Red Bull, but their career totals. And so for Gasly's actually comes out as the best of the bunch, ranks 19th, rating of 0.309. Albon comes out at 34th, rating of career average of 0.153. Perez 51st, career average of negative 0.069. And then Tsunoda is all the way down in 93rd, and I'll let you know there's only about 96 or 97 drivers who qualified, so that means Tsunoda is one of the bottom drivers on this list, with a career average of negative 0.956. Now, of course, being Verstappen's teammate is no easy feat, and often for all these drivers, driving with Verstappen has actually made their career numbers look worse. And so just, in the interest of trying to make things relatively fair, I basically took the liberty of removing the years where they were Verstappen's teammate from their average and just looking at what those numbers are and what their hypothetical ranking would be in that situation. And when you do that, Gasly stays 19th, but his rating does go up to 0.346. Albon would actually jump all the way to 20th if you remove 2020. I kept 2019 just because the numbers are mixed together, and that would get Albon a 0.310. Perez would jump up to 36 with a rating that's now in the positive, 0.106. Tsunoda would still be in the negative, but it would be much closer to 0 with a negative 0.351. But still, 74th is not a great, and it shows that even removing yours being Verstappen's teammate, it does kind of suggest that even just in terms of pure racing ability, race pace, racecraft, ability to score points, it does still kind of suggest that Tsunoda was potentially the worst of the 4. And so, it kind of validates, Red Bull's hesitancy that they've had over the last 2 to 3 seasons to not promote Tsunoda to the Red Bull team, despite the fact that it was, on the surface from the outside, scoring pretty good results for, AlphaTauri, VCARB, Racing Bulls, whatever it was called each of those years. And so that's, I think, a big part of the reason why he's not in, F1 anymore, and why, I think it'll be pretty hard for him to get back. And I think he's going to need a lot of drivers to underperform next year. I think he's going to need a lot of drivers to potentially retire at the end of 2026, and maybe also the F2 crop from next year, and perhaps not performing particularly well, and there not being a ton of great options from the junior categories. I think if you had all those things together, there might be a chance that, Yuki Tsunoda might be able to find himself a seat at Aston Martin, for example. But I think nonetheless, I don't think, Tsunoda did himself a ton of favors this year. I think the race performance was generally not great. Even if there are a ton of, mitigating factors, Verstappen showed in Brazil that, when you have a driver with a lot of talent, you can move through the field. And even, other drivers who multiple times started near the back of the grid, Antonelli, Hamilton, they've shown that they've been at least able to go from back of the grid to scoring some points on multiple occasions. Antonelli did it in Vegas. I think Hamilton did it in Vegas as well, I believe. I think he went from, back of the grid to 10th, and then, of course, that got promoted to 8th with the McLaren disqualification. But generally, Tsunoda was not able to show that often, and he had a lot of chances to do that, given how many times he started near the back of the grid. And so, I don't know. I think it's definitely been a pretty disappointing season. I think it's going to be very hard for Hadjar to, at least in terms of, race performance gaps, do worse than what Verstappen did what Tsunoda did this past year. But again, we shall see. We all thought that Perez 2024 was a new low that was never going to be broken. But then somehow Tsunoda took that bar and somehow find a way to go under that bar. And so again, we'll see how things go. Again, with hindsight, Tsunoda might look a little bit better, just like how Perez looks a little bit better his time at Red Bull after we saw what Lawson and Tsunoda were able to do this year. And again, it'll be really interesting to see how Hadjar does in 2026. You obviously have a new car. It should be a lot more neutral of a car, and it should not be so sculpted so much towards, Verstappen's inclinations. And again, in terms of learning with the car, again, Hadjar should be on level ground with Verstappen from the get-go. And so it'll be really interesting to see how things go in 2026. And again, you never know, perhaps Tsunoda gets himself back into an F1 seat for 2027. And again, maybe he can prove us all wrong and show, whatever's going on at Red Bull, there's very unrepresentative of, actual Grand Prix pace. But there you go. That is my video looking at some of the different factors that I think, in my opinion, explain Tsunoda's misery this past season in F1. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.